Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we are talking about plot. Again. Before we get into this discussion, however, I do want to make a quick point. The thing about a story, the main purpose of a story is to entertain. It's easy to get wrapped up in the idea of going in depth with a character or a message or some sentiment that you find important. However, in these types of stories, things don't tend to happen. It seems to be very flat and boring. A lot of navel gazing and internal monologue and all this really boring drivel kind of stuff. You know, it's people read books and watch movies and enjoy listening to stories because they want to be entertained. And it's really hard to be entertained if nothing's happening. So that's the first big point I want to make. So in my last plot video, I talked about how I don't follow a specific structure while I'm plotting, but I did adapt Dan Wells' 7-point story structure, and I do have these bullet points that I follow while I'm plotting just to make sure that there is enough twists and turns, there are enough twists and turns, that there is enough things actually happening. And I don't just mean in narrative or in exposition. It's your characters actually doing things happening to them, conflict between characters and between outside forces and parts of the world and things like this. So I'm just going to do a quick run through with you of the things that I keep in mind while I'm doing my outline, just to make sure that the course of my novel isn't just a straight flat line with no ups and downs. So the first thing that I have, and this is, when I say first, I mean this can be first line, first page, and it should be very early on, and that is the hook of your story. The hook is what grabs the reader. It's what intrigues them. It's some interesting premise that really pulls the reader into the story and keeps them interested until you can introduce your inciting incident. So the hook could be a cool magic or interesting character, some interesting premise about the world. But like I said, this can be the first line of your book. It could be within the first page of the first chapter. I will do a video on really awesome first lines and how to make the first line of your novel very catchy, so stay tuned for that too. And then the next point that I keep in mind, or that I aim for, is the inciting incident. Now, if you're writing a trilogy or something like this, then your inciting incident can be a little bit further along in your story. But if you're writing your typical 90,000, 100,000 word standalone fantasy novel, you want your inciting incident to be end of first chapter, chapter 2 area. You want it to be very soon. The point of the hook is to grab and keep the reader's attention until the inciting incident happens. And the inciting incident is what shakes up the story. It's what takes your comfortable character and makes them uncomfortable. It's what flips everything on its head. It's the kickoff point of the main plot of the story, essentially. The third point that I aim for is what I like to call the anxiety and dread point. Now, this comes at about the 20-25% mark for me. And what I love about this point is you have the inciting incident, which kicks things off, but the inciting incident comes very early on. So if you're using, for example, a three-act story structure, then this would be the end of Act 1, beginning of Act 2 type of thing. And it's where your reader is at the point where they love your character and they're invested in the story, but then they start getting that feeling of anxiety and dread because they know that the character is going into danger or is venturing on this journey where perhaps they're not going to get everything that they want, so your reader starts to fear for your character. And it's another shake-up plot point. It's where your character kind of delves into the danger. This is in the Fellowship of the Ring. This is where Frodo stands up and says, "I'll take the ring to Mordor," kind of a thing. It's not the inciting incident, but it is what kicks off the middle of the story. It's what propels your reader into the middle of the story. So then that brings us to the middle, which the middle is interesting. There is a problem that a lot of writers have where the middle gets very saggy because nothing happens and it's just a reiteration of everything that happened in the first third of the book. So what I like to do is go into a try-fail cycle. A try-fail cycle is essentially that. Cycles of your character trying to get what they want, and either, yes, they do get what they want, but something else goes wrong, or it's no, they don't get something that they want, and it gets worse. The point of a try-fail cycle is to give your reader the sense of pace, give them a sense that the story is actually moving along. So in your try-fail cycles, let's say you have a character who's trying to find a missing relative. You don't want their first try, my bad. You don't want your character to try to find this missing relative the first time, find them, and then everything's hunky-dory because then there's no story. You want it to be a yes, but no, and situation where either yes, they do find who they're looking for, but something else goes wrong, or no, they don't find who they're looking for, and the situation gets worse. It's all a sense of pacing. It's a way to give the reader an idea that the story is moving forward, even though they're essentially doing the same thing over and over. And in the center of your middle, you want to have a midpoint, which a midpoint's very common in story structure. It's basically the point in the novel where your character goes from reactive to proactive. So it's, instead of your character reacting to what the protagonist or what the antagonist is doing, you want your main character to start taking leaps to do things on their own and being proactive. Protagonist, proactive. Language. So then that brings us to point 5, and that is the low point. It is the belly of the whale in the hero's journey. It is end of Act 2, beginning of Act 3, 75%, 80% mark in your story. And it is where your character just comes to a point where everything sucks. There is no way I can get what I want. There is no way I can defeat this antagonist. And it is just a depressively low point. It is the worst point your character has been at throughout the whole story. And that's really important to have that low point, because the whole middle is your character trying and failing to get what they want. And you don't want to do another one of those. You want to take it down to this very low point to make it seem literally impossible that your character will get what they want. Because that is a perfect setup for the climax, which is the next point. And the climax is when the antagonist and protagonist finally come into conflict. It's where they finally meet. It is the big peak in your story. So having that low point before you get into the climax of your story is very powerful, especially if your protagonist ends up defeating the antagonist and getting what they want. But your climax can be anything. The antagonist could succeed, the protagonist could succeed, whatever, depending on what story you're telling. And then I unfold and unpack the resolution of my book using the mice quotient. I will link that video up here. And it's basically just, you come to the climax, and then you need to close out the rest of the story. For example, in Wizard of Oz, Dorothy gets back from Oz, but the resolution is closing out getting back from Oz closes out the milieu story, that closes out the world. But we still need to close out, for example, her character. Is she satisfied now that she's left her boring farm in Kansas and seen some magic and all of these things? And that's pretty much it. There's a lot more to plot than this. I will get into subplots next week, but those are the big twists and turns that I keep in mind while I'm doing my outline, just to make sure that it's not flat all the way through. So my resource for this week is a video. It is the Writing the $1 Million Outline with Dave Farland / Dave Overton. It's also a video that has just some general really great tips for writers. If you don't know who Dave Farland is, he's a judge for Writers of the Future, very well known in the industry, fantasy and sci-fi author. He also teaches classes for writing, genre fiction in particular, if you're interested in that sort of thing. I'll link to all that stuff below. So go and check that out. Next week we will talk about subplots, so stay tuned for that. I will see you all then, but for now, as usual, you should be writing stuff.